The kind of morning that tricks you into thinking everything is fine starts with good coffee. That was the thing about Thursdays in late October in Halifax. The light came in low and gold through the windows of the Tim Hortons on Gottingen Street, and if you weren't paying attention, you might mistake it for warmth. Finnian Doyle was not paying attention. He was watching his daughter eat a breakfast sandwich with the focused intensity of a 7-year-old who had strong opinions about the ratio of egg to cheese, and he was calculating, quietly, whether he could afford to replace the boiler before December. He couldn't. He already knew the answer. He was just doing the math again because sometimes the math changed if you believed in it hard enough. It didn't change. "Dad," said Nola without looking up from her sandwich. "You're doing the face." "What face?" "The money face." Finnian Doyle was 39 years old, a licensed electrician, and the sole parent of a child who could read him the way other kids read picture books. He picked up his coffee. "I don't have a money face." "You do. It looks like this." She scrunched her forehead and stared at nothing, which was, he had to admit, a fairly accurate impression. "Eat your sandwich, I'm eating it." She took a large, demonstrative bite. "Mrs. Kearney says we're doing a project on families next week." "That's good. She says we have to bring in a photo of everyone in our family." Finnian set down his coffee. "We'll find something." Nola considered this. She was a careful child, not because she was shy. She was almost aggressively not shy, but because she processed things at her own pace and delivered conclusions when she was ready, not a moment before. Her mother had been the same way. He knew this because he had loved her mother for 6 years, and because he had sat next to her mother in the Dartmouth General while the monitors made their sounds and the doctors said the things doctors say, and because the careful way Nola tilted her head when she was thinking looked exactly like Claire. He looked out the window. "Just you and me as a family," Nola said finally. "Right?" "Right," he said. "Exactly right." She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her sandwich. He didn't have the money face. But he had something else, and he felt it in the parking lot when he loaded his toolbox into the truck. That particular weight that had no name. Not grief anymore, exactly. 3 years was long enough that it had changed shape, but something adjacent. The sense of carrying a thing you can't put down because there's nowhere to set it. The dispatch call came in at 8:30. Commercial property on Brunswick Street, a heritage building that had been converted into office suites, was having electrical issues on the 4th floor. Tenant was a law firm. The property manager had said the word urgent 4 times in 30 seconds, which Finnian had learned to interpret as inconvenient for people with money rather than dangerous. He was right, in the end, about the danger. He was wrong about the money. The building was old in the way that Halifax buildings were old, bones that had survived 100 winters, renovations layered on top of each other like sediment, each decade leaving its mark on the wiring. Finnian found the panel in a utility closet on the 4th floor and started with the basics. A breaker that had tripped repeatedly, which usually meant a load issue or something running that shouldn't be. He had been working for about 20 minutes when the door at the end of the hall opened. He registered her the way you register weather, not as a person initially, but as a presence, a change in the quality of the air. She was tall and moved with a particular kind of stillness that wasn't slowness, it was control, the sort of bearing that came from spending years being the most important person in every room and learning to make that look effortless. She was wearing a charcoal blazer and her hair was pulled back and she had reading glasses pushed up on her forehead the way people do when they've been staring at something small for too long. She stopped when she saw him. Not startled, exactly, just recalibrating. "Are they sending someone to the 3rd floor too?" she said. "This is 4th, Finnian said, "just the one call." She looked at the open panel. "The whole suite lost power for about 40 minutes this morning. I had a deposition at 9. "Did the deposition happen?" A pause. "It rescheduled. I'll find the issue." He turned back to the panel. "Probably an hour." He heard her walk back down the hall. He heard her door close. He went back to work. What he didn't know, what the narrator is obliged to tell you here, because Finnian certainly wasn't thinking about it, was that Miriam Voss had been up since 5 that morning, had eaten nothing since the previous afternoon's lunch, had spent 47 minutes on a call with a client who kept calling her sweetheart in that particular way, that men of a certain age use the word to mean something else entirely, and had then lost power to her suite with 12 minutes before a deposition that represented 8 months of case preparation. She had not lost her composure in front of her associates. She had waited until they filed out before she sat on the edge of her desk and breathed slowly. For 60 seconds, the way her therapist had taught her. And then the power had come back on. and there was a man in the hallway with a toolbox, and she had spoken to him like he was maintenance staff because he was holding a toolbox and she was in the middle of something, and that is what her mind had reached for. She knew 10 minutes later that she had been rude, not aggressively rude, just the particular kind of dismissive that she'd been told, twice by people she respected, that she could be without noticing. She went back into the hallway. He was on his knees in front of the panel, and he had the look of someone who had found the problem and was deciding how to characterize it for someone who wouldn't understand the technical version. There's a junction in the wall behind this suite that should have been upgraded when the building was rewired in 2019, he said without turning around. It wasn't. I can fix the immediate issue today, but the building manager needs to know the underlying problem is still there. Will you put that in writing? He did turn around then. He was looking at her steadily, the kind of look that evaluated without performing evaluation. I can, yeah. I'm sorry, she said. For earlier, I was dismissive. He seemed to be deciding whether to accept this on its face or probe it for sincerity. He must have found sincerity because he nodded once. It's not. But I appreciate you saying so. She extended her hand. Miriam Voss, Finnian Doyle. He wiped his hand on his work pants before shaking hers, a gesture so automatic and considerate that she noticed it. Are you the partner or the firm's tenant? Managing partner. She watched something move through his expression. Not intimidations, it's exactly, more like adjustment, a slight recalibration of the landscape. Don't let that change how you talk to me. Wasn't planning to, he said, and went back to work. She stood in the hallway for a moment longer than necessary. She couldn't have explained why. He came back 4 days later for the follow-up work which the property manager had approved after the written report landed on his desk with the particular weight of a document that implied liability. Nola had a half day at school, which meant Finnian had arranged for her to spend the afternoon with his neighbor, Mrs. Pelletier, who was 71 and had opinions about everything and genuinely enjoyed Nola's company in the way that some elderly people genuinely enjoy the company of children who talk too much and ask interesting questions. He was replacing the junction when he heard the elevator open and the sound of Miriam Voss's heels on the hardwood and then the sound of them stopping. You're back. Follow-up work, he said. Should have you sorted by end of day. She had a coffee in each hand. She held one out. I was getting one anyway. You didn't know I'd be. The property manager told me yesterday. A beat. I got an extra. Finnian Doyle accepted the coffee. He was not the kind of man who made things complicated. But he was paying attention, and what he was paying attention to was the particular quality of a gesture that was simple on the surface and had more weight underneath. He had been a married man long enough to know the difference between someone being collegial and someone making a choice. He wasn't sure yet which this was. He drank the coffee. Do you have children? She asked. She was leaning against the wall across from him, not the body language of someone waiting for a meeting. The body language of someone who had decided to stay. A daughter. 7. He didn't volunteer, Claire. You? No. The word landed clean, no performance of wistfulness or defiance around it. I've been asked the question approximately 800 times, so I've gotten efficient about the answer. Fair enough. Her name? Nola. Miriam turned her coffee cup in her hands. What's she like? Finnian considered this with the same seriousness he gave most things. She has opinions about cheese, he said. She's working on a project about families. She told me last week that she thinks dogs should be allowed on the Metro Transit, and she wrote a letter about it that I'm not sure she sent. Miriam made a sound that might, in a different context, have become a laugh. Did the letter have a recipient? The mayor's office, I think. Good instincts, she said. Start at the top. He looked at her then, really looked, the way he hadn't let himself look before. She was 44, he would learn later. She had lines at the corners of her eyes and a particular kind of tiredness that lived not Trasasifus but somewhere behind it, the kind that came from years of being competent and sharp and slightly alone in rooms full of people who deferred to her rather than talked to her. He looked away. I should finish this, he said. Of course, she said. She pushed off the wall, walked 3 steps down the hall, stopped. Finnian. She said his name like she'd been turning it over. I'm having dinner with my colleague on Friday at the press gang. If you happen to be there around 7, I wouldn't consider it a coincidence. He stared at the wall where the junction was. I'll think about it, he said. She walked back to her office. He listened to the door close. He stared at the wall for a long time after that, and the thing he was feeling was not what he expected. He'd expected resistance, the automatic no that had become reflex in 3 years of not letting himself consider anything like this. He felt some of that. But underneath it, and this was the part that unsettled him, underneath it was something he hadn't felt in long enough that he'd almost stopped believing it still existed. He finished the junction. He wrote the report. He drove to pick up Nola from Mrs. Pelletier's. He didn't go to the press gang on Friday. He almost went. That's important to know. He drove past it at 7:12 on his way home from a call that had run late in Dartmouth. He could see the warm light through the window, the kind of restaurant where they'd been serving food since before Confederation, and knew it. He slowed down. He drove past. He told himself it was because of Nola, who was with his sister Bridget on Friday evenings and would be fine. He told himself it was because he didn't know what he'd say. He told himself it was because the whole idea was, what was the word, impractical. She was a managing partner. He was an electrician. These were not insurmountable facts, but they were facts. He told himself these things, and none of them were the real reason. The real reason was in a box on the top shelf of his bedroom closet. It was a photograph of Claire at Peggy's Cove, taken the summer before Nola was born, when Claire was laughing at something off camera and the wind was pulling her hair sideways, and she had looked, like someone who expected to be around for a long time. He hadn't opened the post months, but he knew it was there. He thought about it the way you think about something you're not thinking about. On Sunday, Nola asked if she could have waffles. He made waffles. They were at the kitchen table, and the radio was on, and Nola had maple syrup on her chin and was explaining at length why her friend Bethany was wrong about which season was the best season, autumn. Obviously, this was not a debate. "Do you think you'll ever have a girlfriend?" Nola said in the tone she used for segues that she had been planning for several minutes. Finnian put down his fork. "Why do you ask?" "Mrs. Pelletier says you're handsome and it's a waste." She said it with the perfect neutrality of someone reporting a fact. "I told her I'd ask you. Mrs. Pelletier should mind her business. She's 71, Nola said. She says she's earned it." Finnian looked at his daughter. She had maple syrup on her chin and her mother's careful eyes, and she was watching him the way she'd been watching him for 3 years. Not with worry exactly, but with a kind of readiness, like she was prepared to receive whatever he said and hold it without breaking. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe someday." "Slow, Claire would want you to," she said. He felt the thing in his chest that had no name. "You call her Claire now?" "Mrs. Pelletier says I'm old enough." She picked up her fork. "I call her Mum in my head. But Claire when I talk about her. Because she was a person too, not just my mum." She said it like this was simple, settled, already worked out. "Is that okay?" Finnian Doyle was quiet for long enough that the radio filled the silence with a weather report, and the forecast was clouds moving in by afternoon, possible snow by evening. "Yeah," he said. "That's exactly right." She called the property manager's office the following Wednesday to ask about the completion certificate for the electrical work, which was routine. She asked while she had him on the phone whether there were any other outstanding items on the 4th floor. There weren't. She thanked him. She sat at her desk for a moment. She had been asked in her life by men who thought she should be flattered. She had been asked by men who confused her position for accessibility and her directness for availability. She had learned in her 30s that most people didn't know how to receive a woman like her with any comfort, and she had made a private peace with that. She had not expected to find herself wanting to apologize again to someone who hadn't required an apology, or to explain herself to someone who hadn't asked for an explanation. Her associate Dominic knocked on the doorframe. "You have the Broughton file." "I know." She picked it up. "Close the door on your way out." She worked until 6. She walked to her car in the parkade on Hollis Street. She sat in it for a moment before starting it. She sent a message to the number on the invoice. "I think I made the dinner awkward by calling it a coincidence in advance. I'm going to try again. Are you free for coffee sometime? M. Voss." She started the car and drove home. Her phone buzzed somewhere around Quinpool Road, and she didn't look at it until she was parked, and when she read the message, she sat with it for a moment in the dark car before she let herself do anything with her face. Saturday works. F. Doyle. They met at a place on Yonge Street that was quiet in the mornings and had the kind of coffee that tasted like someone's grandmother had been making it since the building went up, which, given Halifax, was probably true. He was there before her, which she noticed and filed without comment. He had taken the chair that faced the door, which she also noticed. He was in a different jacket than the workwear. A dark gray thing that was clean and suggested he'd thought about showing up without performing that he'd thought about showing up. She sat across from him. "I don't usually do this," he said before she could say anything. "Neither do I," she said. "That's harder to believe." "Is it?" She wrapped both hands around her mug. "Why?" He seemed to think about how to say it. You asked me like you'd practiced. She smiled, unexpected and real. I practiced at its coffee. Something shifted in the set of his shoulders. Not relief, she thought, more like permission. My wife died 3 years ago, he said. November, so it's coming up. I say that not because I want you to feel sorry for me, but because it's context. For why I didn't come on Friday and why I almost didn't come today. Miriam received this the way she received things in depositions, without performance, just attention. What stopped you from not coming? My daughter asked me if I was ever going to have a girlfriend, a beat, and that was compelling. She's 7, and she quoted her 71-year-old neighbor at me. I felt ganged up on. Miriam laughed. It was a laugh that started in her chest rather than her throat, and it surprised her a little. What did you tell her? Mabes someday. He looked up, which felt like lying a little less than it usually does. She held that. The radiator in the corner was making a sound, and somewhere in the kitchen someone was grinding beans, and outside on Young Street a cyclist went past in the October wind wearing a jacket that was not warm enough. And all of it was mundane and specific and real in a way that Miriam Voss had not felt in a room in longer than she could immediately calculate. I work too much, she said. I've been told this by 3 people this year, and 2 of them were people I pay to be honest with me, so I think it might be true. I don't have family here. My parents are in Kelowna. I have colleagues who I like, but liking colleagues is a professional relationship with better food. She turned her mug. I'm telling you this because you told me something real and it seemed like the appropriate response. It was, he said. I'm not looking for easy, she said. I'm not looking for casual. I don't have the elasticity for it anymore. Me neither. She looked at him across the table and thought about the junction in the wall behind her 4th-floor suite, the thing that had been wrong for years and hadn't announced itself until it finally, quietly, gave out. She thought about the way he'd told the property manager about it in writing, carefully and without drama, because it mattered to get it right. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They ordered more coffee. They stayed until the lunchtime crowd started coming in, which was 2.5 hours later, and the woman behind the counter gave them a look that was not unfriendly but was communicative, and they took the hint and left. On the sidewalk, he said, Nola has a school thing on the 15th, some kind of autumn fair. He said it to the middle distance, not a lot. Miriam zipped her jacket. The wind off the harbor was making itself known. Is that an invitation? It might be. I'll clear my schedule, she said. He nodded, looked at her briefly, looked away. You don't have to impress her. I know. She started walking toward her car. I want to. The autumn fair was in the school gymnasium, which smelled of floor wax and juice boxes, and had been decorated by people who understood that children's aesthetic opinions were strong and unapologetic. So there were orange and yellow streamers everywhere and a pumpkin carving station that already had a line. Miriam stood at the entrance in a jacket she'd bought the night before because she didn't own anything that said gymnasium on a Saturday and had made her peace with that. Finnian came through the parking lot with Nola, who was wearing a costume that appeared to be a fox, ears, a tail, a bright orange tunic, and who stopped walking when she saw Miriam and evaluated her with the open scrutiny that 7-year-olds deploy without self-consciousness. You're the one from work, Nola said. I am, Miriam said. You're the one who wrote to the mayor. Nola's expression shifted fractionally toward interest. He didn't write back. His loss, Miriam said. The Metro Transit argument is airtight. Finnian was watching them both with the particular quality of attention of someone who was hoping for something and not letting himself expect it. Nola considered Miriam for another moment. Do you like pumpkin carving? I've never done it. Never. The scandal in Nola's voice was genuine. Okay, I'll show you. She turned and walked into the gymnasium without further preamble, apparently having made a decision. Finnian fell into step beside Miriam. Sorry, he said quietly. She does that. Don't apologize, Miriam said. She was watching Nola weave through the crowd toward the pumpkin station. She's remarkable. He was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. She is. The fair was 2 hours. Miriam learned how to carve a pumpkin under the supervision of a 7-year-old who had strong opinions about the nose shape and accepted no compromises on the teeth. She ate a cider donut from a table run by the Parent Volunteer Association and could not remember the last time she'd eaten something that came on a paper napkin. She lost a ring toss game to a child she didn't know and found this genuinely funny. At one point, Nola was across the gymnasium playing something involving bean bags, and Finnian was standing next to Miriam with a coffee he'd gotten from the parents' table, and the noise of 60 children doing autumn fair activities was all around them. And he said, "You okay?" She realized she'd been just standing there, watching Nola. "Yes," she said, "I'm good." She meant it. "I'm actually good." She looked up and found him looking at her with an expression she hadn't quite seen on him before. Something open and careful at the same time, the expression of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and is noticing with surprise that his hands are slightly less full than they were. She looked back at Nola. Nola, across the gymnasium, threw a beanbag and missed entirely and laughed with her whole body, the unself-conscious physical laugh of someone who has not yet learned to be careful with joy. Miriam felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was held. There was a night in December when the snow was doing what Halifax snow does, which is arrive with intention and stay, and Finnian's truck was in Miriam's driveway because the roads had gotten bad around 9. And she had said, practically, that the guest room was made up. He had called Bridget to explain, and Bridget, who had met Miriam exactly once and had already formed an opinion, had said obviously yes before he'd finished the sentence. Nola was asleep in the guest room because there had been a conversation about logistics, and Miriam had said there was a second bed in there, and Nola had said she wanted to see the big window, and that had been that. They were at the kitchen table with tea, which was the hour when the practical things had been sorted and the thing underneath the practical things made itself known. "I have to tell you something," Finnian said. Miriam set down her mug. "There's a box in my closet," he said. "Photos, some things of Claire's. I haven't looked at it in a while, but I think about it." He turned his tea. I want you to know I'm not trying to replace anything. I'm not trying to build something that looks like what I had. I've thought about that a lot." "What are you trying to build?" she asked, not a challenge. A real question. He was quiet long enough that the heating system made a sound and the wind moved something outside. "Something new," he said. "I think. Something that's its own thing." Miriam looked at her hands. She had given herself a long time, the kind of time that stretched from one end of her 30s to the other, telling herself she was building something, a career, a reputation, a life that was complete in the shape it had. She believed it while she believed it. And then she had met a man in a hallway who wiped his hand on his pants before shaking hers so she wouldn't get grease on her blazer. And she had felt, for the first time in a long time, like there might be a shape she hadn't accounted for. "I don't need you to be ready for everything at once," she said. "I just need you to be honest with me, that I can do. Then we're fine." He looked at her across the kitchen table, her kitchen in the house in the South End that she'd bought at 38, and spent 6 years filling with things that were right, and still somehow not quite enough. The kitchen with the good light and the window over the sink that looked out onto the backyard where there was now, as of tonight, a child sleeping 2 rooms away. "Yeah," he said, "we're fine." Outside, the snow kept coming down, the quiet kind that covers everything, makes the city look briefly like it has no history, no sediment, just white and clean and possible. It wouldn't last. It never did. By morning, the plows would have been through and the slush would have started, and Halifax would look like itself again. But for now it was just the snow, and the kitchen, and the tea going cold, and somewhere down the hall a 7-year-old who had written to the mayor and not received a reply, and had decided that was the mayor's problem and not hers. Sometimes you make a plan that turns out to be wrong. Sometimes you carry something for so long that you forget you're carrying it. Sometimes a junction in a wall that was never properly finished finally gives out, and someone shows up with the right tools, and they write it down so it doesn't get ignored again. That's the thing about the work that matters. You have to name what's broken before you can fix it, and then you have to trust the person who shows up. Nola had decided to trust Miriam approximately 40 minutes into the autumn fair, which was 2 hours faster than Finnian had managed. But then, Nola had always been the one who paid attention without pretending she wasn't. She had her mother's eyes and her father's hands, and she was building one careful conclusion at a time, a complete picture of what her family was allowed to become. She had decided it was allowed to become this. And Nola, as anyone who knew her could tell you, was not wrong about things very often.